Shareholders of Silicon Valley Bank have filed a class action lawsuit following the bank's collapse. It was one of two banks, along with New York's Signature Bank, regulators took over this past weekend. Reporter Skylar Henry has the very latest.
The stock market held steady Tuesday morning. The Dow Jones opened higher as jitters caused by the failure of two major banks seems to be easing. On Monday, trading halted for more than a dozen other regional banks after steep drops. It was fallout from the collapse of California-based Silicon Valley Bank and the closure of New York's Signature Bank. President Biden tried to reassure Americans.
Our banking system is safe. Your deposits are safe.
We were pretty worried.
Sam Ling is the CEO of a software startup that had millions in deposits with SVB. He praised the administration's decision to guarantee all deposits, even those that exceeded the $250,000 limit.
Definitely very assuring. I think the government this time moved really fast.
President Biden said he intends to ask Congress and regulators to strengthen the rules for banks to help stave off future failures.
No bank holds enough cash that when all the depositors want their money back simultaneously, they don't have it.
Gary Cohn, the top economic advisor in the Trump administration, appeared on CBS Mornings. He says these situations are why the FDIC insures deposits.
The reason the FDIC insurance was created is to protect your mom and my dad, to make them feel comfortable to leave their money in a bank knowing it's secure.
The White House stressed that executives and investors for both banks will not be bailed out.
All right, joining me now is Matthew Faulkner, who is assistant professor at San Jose State. First of all, let's start with what happened here. What happened to Silicon Valley Bank and why did it fail so quickly, it seemed like?
Yeah, we can all relate in our personal lives that money was flowing pretty wildly for a few years. And in the very recent times, we've all tightened up a bit. Well, that happened in the startup community. So there weren't as many startups piling money into Silicon Valley Bank. Interest rates have increased a lot, which affected some of the investments of the bank, the safe bond investments you would typically think of the bank. And it led to customers being concerned about, can they meet all of the liquidity demands? And it became your stereotypical textbook run on the bank.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like it happened really fast, though, 48 hours, and folks were just pulling out their money as fast as they could. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said the federal government would not bail out SVB, and over the weekend, they kind of decided on a new plan. What's the difference between this plan and a bailout? Because I think when a lot of people hear bailout, they think 2008, the banks are failing. What are we going to do?
Right. The biggest difference here is they're not using taxpayer money to fund this. That was a big argument of, in 2008, people were having to leave their homes and foreclose on their homes, but yet the big banks were getting bailed out and people felt unfair with that. So this administration has made sure to say, any losses that come up from Silicon Valley Bank, we're going to assess a fee or assess a tax on all the other banks in the US to cover that loss, rather than taking the government funds, your taxpayer dollars, to pay for that loss.
So the taxpayers aren't going to be paying the bill now, but is there a possibility down the line that we could see an impact? And what about the customers of these two banks? Are they going to be paying the price for this too?
Well, it's all those depositors at the banks will get all their money, and that's slightly different than what the law would have ever said, where you're only guaranteed $250,000 plus whatever they can get their hands on. So down the road, there's one argument that says, well, if bank fees go up in the future because banks had a tax to help cover a loss of Silicon Valley Bank, we all may see a little piece here. But overall, I don't think it'll get passed on to us in an extreme extent.
Were you surprised, I'm curious, Professor Faulkner, that another bigger bank didn't swoop in and acquire a place like Silicon Valley Bank and say, okay, we'll take on all your debts, we'll take you over and acquire them so quickly? Or do you think that's still a possibility?
Yes and no, it'll be in pieces. But okay. I think to what you said is this bank is very unique. They're working with the startup community, which is our backyard. So they specialize in that. So to find another bank that wants to take on all that new specialty will take a little bit longer. Secondly, as you also mentioned, it happens so fast. So through time, it'll get broken apart and banks will assume different portions of Silicon Valley Bank. but it'll take a little bit of time.
I can imagine, though, with some of these loans, especially with startup loans, those are considered high risks because some of those businesses don't end up making it. So very few banks would want to take on that kind of debt. What's next for SVB customers, though, now? Are they going to be slowly taking their money out of those banks? What would you suggest if you were advising somebody who had money with SVB?
I think a lot of the clients probably ran and got as much of their deposit as they could, but then they had to go find another bank to put their accounts in, which there's probably going to be a bit of a run towards the even larger banks in the US, and a little bit of fear towards, not that this one wasn't large, but a little bit of fear towards regional banks in the short term. But my advice is for businesses that have a lot of money, they'll have to deal with this in a different way. But for us as consumers, if we have accounts with more than $250,000 in it, and we're that fortunate, open up a second account at another bank and put $250,000 in each one.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question. The FDIC only insures up to $250,000. I know the government says the depositors in SVP will be able to get their money back, but if anything above $250,000, is that kind of up in the air? They may not get all of it back?
So right now, the government said they'll front all the money to get all your deposits back. And then if there are any losses, that'll be that tax to all the other banks that will have to chip in to cover that loss. So the FDIC is essentially given an unlimited insurance per se, but they're not going to foot the bill if there are losses from that.
Yeah, there's nothing in this world I don't think is unlimited. One last question. I think a lot of folks are a little nervous when you hear the term banking collapse, you hear bailout, you think people aren't going to get their money back, the government is stepping in. There's some fear, and I think a lot of people have some anxiety going back to 2008, knowing what happened then. Do you think this is a precursor to something similar to 2008?
I'd say no. It doesn't appear that there was a bunch of really bad loans like 2008 that were given. This seems fairly isolated, at least at a smaller extent. Secondly, the government stepped in way faster than they ever have in the past, and also assured all the other banks that could have issues with depositors wanting to get money back, they can take short-term loans from the government to get any access to capital they need. So I feel that the financial system as a whole is pretty sound and solid.
All right. Professor Matthew Faulkner, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.